Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the co-host and the content director here at Word on Fire. And with me is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, it is always good to be talking with you.
Well, it's a delight, Brandon, to be with you, so thanks.
So let's catch everyone up a little bit on what's been going on in your life. I don't think we've talked since you returned from the Philippines, so give us maybe some of your quick impressions of that long and great trip.
Oh my gosh, yeah, you're right, it was a long trip. From LA to Manila, it was 15 hours. And that was an unforgettable day because I flew 15 hours. I think I slept for maybe a couple hours in the hotel, and then off we went because we arrived, I don't know, sometime in the morning. And then what I thought was going to be one talk became an afternoon with Bishop Barron. And so I gave the talk. Then there was an open kind of conversation. There were about 6,000 people there too. I must say Word on Fire is very well known in the Philippines. Thank God. So we had the open conversation and then Mass and a homily, after which I was completely exhausted. And they actually had planned an evening at the seminary where I'd go and have dinner and then talk to the seminarians. And I must confess, I said to the organizers, no, I'm not going to the seminary. I said, I'm just too exhausted. But it was thrilling, talk to 6,000. But then the next day we flew to Cebu where the International Eucharistic Congress was held. And I gave a talk to 15,000 people in the big arena. So that was just a thrill. The third talk I gave was to about 5,000 young people who were gathered in a little town outside of Cebu. And I get to the arena, and it is like hopping with music, and there's lasers going on. There's a pop singer singing. The kids are all jumping around. And I said to the organizer, now, there's something in between this and my talk, right? And she said, no, you're on next. So as I intuited, just coming out after that and trying to get these kids to settle down was a little difficult. But I just plowed through my talk, and about, maybe halfway through, they kind of settled down to listen. But it was an amazing trip. I'd never been to the Philippines. As everybody says, the Filipinos are some of the nicest, most welcoming people in the world, and they lived up to that reputation. Anyway, it was a thrill. Then it was about a 13-hour flight back to LA, and it took me a couple days to recover from that. But yeah, it was wonderful.
So after your recovery, you didn't stop, as is your wont. You were go, go, go. And on Friday of last week, Friday, February 5th, you participated in an interfaith dialogue in Santa Barbara. So there were several different religious leaders who came together, and the topic was Care for Our Common Home, an interfaith dialogue on Pope Francis's call for environmental action. So tell us a little bit about this. How did it come about? What was your role in it? And what were some of your impressions?
Well, it came about because of a deanery meeting about 4 months ago. I had just gotten here. The deanery is the meeting of the priests in a given area. This was the deanery right around me here in Santa Barbara. And to that meeting came this Protestant minister. And he was introduced, and he said, I'd like to continue with our ecumenical efforts. And he said, what I'm thinking about is let's do something on Pope Francis and his encyclical, and Bishop, would you be willing to be part of that? So I said, yeah, I'm all in favor of ecumenical conversation. He seemed like a nice guy. But, frankly, I envisioned, 12 or 15 people around a table that we'd have a local conversation. Well, as it developed, there were 250 people there, I think, that night. So the word got out and that I would be speaking. And I didn't really envision that either. I thought he meant just be around the table and kind of, trigger the conversation. So it turned into an address, and there were Buddhists in the audience. There were a lot of Hindus. There were Muslims. There were Protestant Christians. It was really a very impressive gathering. So I gave a talk on the encyclical, and then there were 4 panelists afterwards who gave their own presentation and they didn't really respond to my talk because they didn't have it in advance, but it was, a bit of a dialogue. Then it was open for Q&A. So it was a very lively, very interesting, very cordial gathering. And boy, was there a positive feeling about the Pope. I mean, from the beginning of the evening, they had a PowerPoint cycling through photos and quotes from the Pope. And that's what I tried to take advantage of, was this encyclical, which is deeply Catholic, I argued, also sends a lot of bridges to other religions.
So the encyclical we're talking about, Laudato Si, was recently released by Pope Francis to great fanfare. So let's dig into your talk a little bit. You've written and you've done a couple of videos on Laudato Si, but what'd you focus on for this talk?
Well, you know what I did is I put it in two different contexts. The first one was the context of Romano Guardini, and the second was the context of the book of Genesis. Now, why Guardini? Well, the 50-year-old Jorge Mario Bergoglio, when he found himself kind of on the losing side of a political battle in the Jesuit order in Argentina, yes, there are politics in the church. So it was kind of a dark time in his life. He was suddenly kind of out of power. And when you exile a Jesuit, you send him to doctoral studies. So off he went to Germany. Why? To study Romano Guardini, whom he reverenced. Well, now, who is Romano Guardini? One of the really great and influential theologians of the 20th century, hugely impactful on Vatican II. He was a mentor to Joseph Ratzinger. He was admired by Karl Rahner, so a hugely important player. Well, Bergoglio goes to Germany and to write a doctoral paper, which didn't work, by the way. He came home after a year. I think he was too old to start doctoral studies at 50, and he was homesick. He was unhappy, so it didn't come to fruition. However, he spent a lot of time reading Guardini. And what I emphasized was this. Go back to Guardini's great little book called Letters from Lake Como. It's a place in Italy he liked to vacation. He was, with that lovely Italian name, he was nevertheless a German culturally. His parents brought him to Germany when he was just 1 year old. Anyway, like a lot of Germans, he liked to vacation in Italy, and he went to the lake region around Milano, where Lake Como is. And what he explains now in these letters is the shift that took place from a sort of pre-modern to a modern consciousness. And he saw it around Lake Como. In the beginning, when he first went there, he'd see how the homes were very much in harmony with the natural environment. They followed the lines and rhythms of the countryside, etc. And he noticed the way boats plied the waters of Lake Como. In the beginning, he said, they did it in a kind of respectful way. They would kind of roll with the waves, etc. But then as the years went by, he saw the motorized boats that cut through the water in a kind of indifferent way, getting where they need to go. And now he's making a much broader point here. The point that in the modern consciousness, think of someone like Francis Bacon, who said, we should put nature on the rack and force her to give up her secrets. What an aggressive, attitude toward nature. Think of Aristotle, the ancient world, who would say philosophy begins in wonder. And the philosopher's attitude, and for him that would mean what we mean by science too, the philosopher's attitude is one of contemplation. Well, with Bacon, you get a very different thing. It's the aggressive modern mind that wants to know and master and control. And now a little bit after Bacon, you've got René Descartes, essentially the founder of modern philosophy. Descartes said, we need to master nature. So in the first case, nature is like a prisoner that you want to rack and get information out of. In the second case, nature's like a slave that you want to master, so you dominate. Well, Guardini says this attitude that began back in the 16th and 17th centuries has now come to dominate ordinary consciousness, that we think of nature as just something that we need to control and master and dominate. And here he becomes a kind of postmodern hero, Guardini, because he's critical of the aggressive rationality of modernity. Well, I suggested in the talk that on almost every page of Laudato Si, you can discern Guardini's influence. And the Pope, in fact, in Laudato Si, even mentions how homes should be built according to natural rhythms. That's right out of Letters from Lake Como. So I made that point to contextualize it. This is not just like the global warming encyclical. That's to miss the forest for one very particular tree. I wanted to put it in this broader theological context, whereby the human project is situated in the context of nature and the environment. It's not there to be mastered by us, dominated, but we're meant to live in a sort of contemplative harmony with it. So that was my first incursion in trying to understand this encyclical.
So you helped them to understand Laudato Si in light of Guardini, but also you said in light of Genesis. So what points did you focus on there?
Well, here I wanted to say behind both Bergoglio and Guardini, two nice Italian names, by the way, behind these two figures is the great witness of the Bible. And I said, now to get this, we have to go back to the very beginning of the book of Genesis. And I think it's a very subtle move that the author of Genesis makes there, because as things come forth from the speech of God, God says, let there be light, and there's light. God says, let the earth be formed. God says, let the earth teem with wild animals, et cetera, et cetera. What are you seeing? You're seeing, first of all, a de-divinization or dethronement of any claim of these things to divinity. So walk through the whole of what God creates in Genesis. In some culture in the ancient world, at some time, all those things were worshipped as gods, right? Sun, moon, planets, the stars, the earth itself, animals of various kind, rivers, mountains, right? All those things at one time or another were worshipped in the ancient world. The author of Genesis is saying, no, don't worship them. These are all creatures of God. So it sets nature in its proper place, not something to be reverenced or worshipped. Now, at the same time, watch how they come forth in their orderly and harmonious ranks, much like a liturgical procession. As each one comes, and then, that was the first day, then evening came, morning followed the second day, and that's described. And then evening came, morning followed the third day. It's just like a stately liturgical procession, at the end of which comes the human being. Now, who's the most important member of a liturgical procession? The one that comes at the end, right? What's the role of nature? Not to be worshipped, but rather to give worship. The purpose of nature is to witness to the Creator God. But nature can't speak. Who's the one element now, as far as we know, in nature that can speak? Human beings. What's our job is to be the great priests of this cosmic liturgy. We lead nature in the praise of the true God. And so now nature finds its proper, dignified place. I mean, you're not going to be abusing and misusing this beautiful liturgical procession. No, that nature's meant to give praise to God, but precisely under the leadership of the human being. And so I suggested the famous phrase about becoming stewards of creation, having dominion over it, does not mean domination. It means that we become the liturgical high priests of the cosmic praise of God. And I link that finally to the temple in Jerusalem, covered inside and out with images of the created world. Because the praise taking place there was not just human beings praising God, but these great priests praising God on behalf of all creation. And I suggested that is the right way to understand us in relation to the environment. Then I think we get all the accents right. We don't fall into an abuse of nature. At the same time, we don't fall into a worship of nature or a hyper stress on nature. I think that's the right liturgical balance. Anyway, that was really the burden of my maybe half-hour talk that night.
So I'm guessing as you're giving the talk, a lot of the Protestant leaders were probably nodding their head in agreement with your framing of the talk in light of the Bible. But I am curious, how did some of the other religious leaders react? I mean, what did they say during the following panel discussion?
Well, I found a lot of things interesting about it. There was a very strong presence of Muslims there. And one of the panelists was an imam from the community. Younger man, maybe in his high 30s, gave a very compelling presentation, I thought. And I don't know that much about the Quran, to be honest with you. I mean, I've read bits and pieces of it. But he was going through a number of things in the Quran that I thought were very congruent with what I was trying to argue. He talked about how when a pious Muslim prays, he purposely gets down on the ground. And so it's a link right away to the earth, that we're not praying in alienation, but we're praying in some ways with the earth. He told me something too. I didn't really realize that there's water always involved in Muslim prayer. And again, the same idea of including the elements. But also he insisted the Quran talks about praying on behalf of nature, giving voice to the praise of nature. And I thought that was very interesting. And I told him afterwards, I didn't realize that. And it's very close to the way I was trying to read the Bible. There was a Presbyterian minister on the panel. He spoke mostly about how much he admires Pope Francis and how much Francis has meant to him. And he said, too, I think correctly, that a lot of early Protestantism was in line with the sort of Bacon Cartesian view and did become, he said, too rationalistic, too aggressive. He recognized those tendencies precisely in Protestantism, then observed that in much more recent years, they've made a lot of shifts and now, see the importance of the commonality between us and nature. There was a representative from the Native American tradition. And, as we all know, and she brought this out very clearly, there's a strong sense there of connection to nature, praying for the water and the winds and so on. And she was good at pointing that out. I caught a little bit of what I call the kind of prelapsarian view that you get sometimes in the Native American spokespeople, almost as though the Native Americans just had this totally together. I mean, they understood all this perfectly from the beginning. They weren't given over to, the ways of violence and all that. And I always get a little bit skeptical because my biblical consciousness said, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So there was no, I think, civilization prior to the fall that, fully exemplifies all the right attitudes, et cetera. And is there a little bit of a tendency, I'm sure if I pressed her, she would deny that, but toward almost a worship of nature, almost seeing nature as divine. And during the Q&A, I insisted on that at one point, that nature is great, it's good, even very good, says the Bible. It's meant to be this great chorus of praise. But as Augustine said, look higher. Whenever you look out at nature and you see its beauties, terrific, but look higher, look higher. What we worship is the Creator God, not what's been created. We appreciate it. It's good, even very good, but we don't worship it. So I try to stress the properly spiritual context.
Any reactions from the Buddhist or the Hindu leaders?
No, I don't remember anything from the floor. I got a little bit from the kind of secularist background. So there were people there clearly who were not believers. And there was a guy who was kind of an aging hippie type. He's probably about 70 years old now. And he said, there are some of us here who don't believe in creation. We believe that our body just came forth from the earth, et cetera. So he made his point, and I said, yeah, but don't make this mistake of thinking those two things are mutually exclusive. I mean, yes, indeed, the body, we can say, through all sorts of evolutionary processes, came to where it is now. But I said, that's in no way in conflict with a creation view. And I tried to clarify that creation means the rapport that obtains even now between non-contingent being and contingent being. So evolution names a biological process, but creation names a metaphysical state. And those two are not mutually exclusive. And I think that's a problem often with secularists, I find, is they take a very literalistic, somewhat naive construal of religion as the default position. And I'm trying to tease people out of that. Here's another one. A lady got up and she said, would you say, Bishop, that the greatest problem facing us today, the greatest moral problem, is our abuse of the environment? And I said, no. The greatest moral problem is sin, which is falling out of friendship with God. And I said, that then has 1,000 consequences, one of which is an indifference to nature and all that. But I said, no, I would say sin is the greatest problem. And recovering a sense of God and then a friendship with God is priority one. From that will come the right attitude toward the environment. But I don't think the environment's problem number one. So I kept trying to bring it back to a religious, so not to reduce religion to environmentalism, which is a big issue out here, and I totally get that. Someone mentioned, for example, how in some ways the environmental movement began in Santa Barbara from an oil spill many, many years ago, like I think in the 70s. And it aroused people to a deeper consciousness of the earth and how we abuse it and so on. And I said, great. That's great. I'm proud that Santa Barbara is one of the, sources of that movement. But we don't worship the earth. We honor the earth and we reverence it. We pray on its behalf, but we don't worship it. So anyway, that was my little, contribution.
This whole event, it kind of symbolizes a phenomenon that's been growing over the last few years, and that's a relationship between Pope Francis and many Protestant Christians, and especially many evangelicals. You mentioned the Presbyterian minister there who was very positive about Pope Francis. I think of others like Bishop Tony Palmer, the Episcopal bishop who unfortunately died recently, but who was a close friend of Pope Francis, and they've worked together. I think, too, of Rick Warren, your friend, who's a pastor, maybe the most popular Protestant pastor in our country. He has been over to the Vatican, I think, a couple times. He was giving the keynote address at the World Meeting of Families. He's referred to Pope Francis as Holy Father and says he watches EWTN. So, I mean, there seems to be this convergence of evangelicals and the Pope in particular, but Catholics in general. And here we are on the eve of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. What do you make of all that? Why does Pope Francis seem to have this draw toward Protestants and evangelicals in particular?
I think it's fascinating to watch how the Holy Spirit works in the choosing of popes. Because you think of these great heroic popes in my lifetime, especially John Paul II. And there's Francis, who's not John Paul II. He's a very different figure. You won't find that sort of philosophical precision. You're not going to find the theological wisdom of a Pope Benedict. What you find, though, with Francis is this great genius for the provocative gesture. He has an instinct for the essentials that I think is attractive, to any Christian. An instinct for, the mercy of God, for care for the marginalized and the poor. He speaks in the manner of Jesus. He acts in the manner of Jesus. And I think that legitimately builds bridges. It reaches out to Christians of any stripe. But as we've seen, not just Christians, but religious people of any stripe, even secularists, it's the simplicity and power of his gestures that I think build these bridges. There's something about his personality that is just very warm and very welcoming. Even though, he can certainly, when it comes to people within the church, he can be pretty blunt and pretty critical and direct. But I think his manner toward the outside world is very, involving and inviting, welcoming. But it's the instinct for the provocative gesture that cuts to the heart of Christianity, that appeals across the board, I think.
You recently wrote an article called Pope Francis and the Evangelicals, and one of the elements you focused on was his emphasis on evangelical urgency, that today the basic mission of the church is to proclaim the gospel to people who are indifferent or have never heard it. Do you think this is part of the reason why so many evangelical Christians are drawn to him?
Yeah, that's part of it, I think. So this provocative gesture, yes, indeed. But also, it's an instinct for the basics, it's an instinct for the essential matters. And yeah, I think he knows, as you and I know very well, the numbers of people who are falling away from the Catholic Church, a sort of attenuation of Christianity through much of the West. He gets that, yeah. And Evangelii Gaudium, which I think is a great document and sums up well a lot of the best instincts of the new evangelization. Sure, Protestant Christians will get that. And they like the fact that Catholics are speaking with this evangelical urgency. See, in some ways, I think it's a work of the Holy Spirit that we've been shaken out of a certain institutional complacency. We had this grand international institutional structure. People came to it and got evangelized in great numbers. But when that began to break down, as it did after Vatican II, and now in many ways is in full retreat, now we got to find a different strategy, and it's re-evangelizing a lot of people who have grown indifferent to the faith. I'm continually amazed. Maybe I shouldn't be, but how ignorant a lot of people are of the Christian basics. Where even like 50 years ago, you could assume in our country that the vast majority of people had the Christian basics in place. That's not true anymore. You know that, don't you? Working with younger people. Things that we would just take utterly for granted, they just are kind of clueless about. I remember Cardinal George, my great mentor, saying, it takes one generation of the faith not being communicated effectively to lose it. It's not like it's just hanging around there. It's got to be communicated. And we know more and more that it's not being communicated effectively. So Pope Francis gets that, I think, and that's why we have this urgency about evangelization, which a lot of our Protestant friends have been, I think, more aware of than we've been. So that's a bridge. That's a bridge for sure.
It's now time to receive one of our weekly questions from our listeners. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, you can go to askbishopbarron.com and record your question either on your phone or your computer. And each episode, we choose one question for Bishop Barron to answer. Today, we're hearing from John, who asks a question related to Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment. It deals with natural evils, things like tsunamis or hurricanes or animals killing other animals. So here's John.
Hi, this is John from New Jersey. I've often heard that God doesn't cause evil, but he allows it to exist for the greater good of freedom and free will. But how do you explain natural evil, such as natural disasters, animals devouring one another? Why does God allow that, since that has nothing to do with free will?
Yeah, it's a great question. We need, a year course to deal with that adequately. It's the great question in many ways. Some have argued that theology is theodicy. Theodicy meaning the branch of theology that deals with justifying God in the presence of evil. So in some ways, it's the question that generates much of the interest of theology. So it's a hard thing. You're quite right in the distinction you make between what the church would call moral evil, and that's evil that comes from the bad use of our freedom, and what's called physical evil. So physical evil would be the tsunamis, the earthquakes, and so on that kill maybe tens of thousands of people, and cancer in a 5-year-old child. I mean, that sort of thing that is actually much more puzzling, because you're furthermore right in saying the classic defense for moral evil is that God so deeply respects our freedom, he doesn't fussily intervene to interrupt it. So you'd say, well, look, Hitler's coming along, and doesn't God get it that this kid's going to grow up to be Hitler? Why doesn't God just give him cancer when he was 7 and let's get it over with? Well, the answer, at least a gesture toward an answer, is that God so respects free will, free choice, that he allows that to unfold even with dire consequences. Now, shift to your question about physical evil. I think the best voice right now on that is John Polkinghorne. Maybe a name you don't know, but you should, because he was a Cambridge particle physicist, so operating at a very high level of science, who at midlife became an Anglican priest, and so writes in a very persuasive way, I think, about religion and science. Well, he proposes something analogous to the free will defense, namely the free process defense. What he means is God creates this universe with its own interior laws and tendencies and so on, a universe that includes anomalies. Like, for example, he'll say the very thing that causes evolution to move forward positively is the same dynamic that causes cancer. Namely, there's some anomalous development of cells. His point there is that there are these kind of anomalies and tensions within nature that are both good and bad. His overall point is that God allows the processes of the universe to unfold freely and does not intervene in a fussy way, the same way he doesn't intervene with our freedom. So earthquakes and cancers and tsunamis and so on, the processes of nature unfolding according to their own inner dynamic and rhythm. God does not customarily intervene or interfere with that. And so God permits evils like the thousands who die in a tsunami, the child who dies of leukemia, so as to allow this greater good of the free process of nature. And let me end, because I know any time you address this issue, I get it. I feel it too. You feel like, that's not satisfying. Well, of course it isn't. Of course it isn't. I'll tell you why exactly. Because the overarching issue always here is finite minds cannot take in the workings of an infinite mind. So you say God in his involvement with the world. Well, you have an infinite mind who's dealing with all of space and all of time. What's he up to? Why is he doing that? Well, do we even think we could possibly grasp it with any kind of adequacy? To use a vague but still telling analogy, a 3-year-old child understands everything his parents are doing, even things that are hurting him. Oh, I totally understand. No, he couldn't even in principle understand. His mind is not capacious enough. Well, now, a fortiori, our little puny minds, looking at the workings of an infinite mind vis-a-vis all of space and all of time. We even expect we're going to come up with an answer that's satisfactory? So what we talked about so far are gestures in the direction of an answer, like the free will defense, the free process defense. But, finally, we surrender, as Job did, to God's overwhelming and ineffable providence. So anyway, that's a very, very, very brief and inadequate response to a question, the articulation of which would require a whole year of a theology class.
If you want more on that question, Bishop Barron's Mystery of God study program contains a whole lesson and a study guide that deal with a lot of these similar questions on the problem of evil and different ways that church leaders have answered it over the years. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. We'll be back next week with another dialogue. Next week, we'll be talking about Bishop Barron's first confirmation, not his, but confirmations that he carried out in a parish. It was his first confirmations as bishop. So we'll chat about that next week. In the meantime, I wanted to mention a couple resources. One is the website laudatosi.com. That's laudatosi.com. And there we have a lot of Bishop Barron's commentary on Pope Francis's encyclical on creation. Also, if you go to wordonfireshow.com and click on this episode, you'll find several other related links and articles and videos to go deeper into what we've discussed here. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Word on Fire show.